This is the second part of the photosynthesis lesson series. So let's go ahead and jump in. I have a video to show, but I'm going to kind of wait till the end and see if we have time. And if not, that's something you can watch separately. And we talked about this in the first introductory photosynthesis lesson about the two cycles of photosynthesis. There's the light reaction and the Calvin cycle, and you can actually break up the word photosynthesis to go with each of those. So you have the photo cycle and you have the synthesis cycle. The photo cycle is what uses the light to make ATP and NADPH, so you turn light energy into chemical energy. And then the synthesis part of photosynthesis is where you actually synthesize the sugar. This talk is going to focus primarily on the light reaction, and then the next talk on photosynthesis will focus on the Calvin cycle. So let's talk about the light cycle. There's two kind of things that can go on here, and it's, if you look up here, you got the non-cyclic electron flow and cyclic electron flow, okay? And we're going to talk about kind of what that means. I know this looks very intimidating. There's a lot going on, but you don't need to know all this details. You just need to know kind of the main overview, okay? So I'll tell you the things you need to know. In the first photosynthesis talk, we talked about these two photosystems, okay? You got photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. These are just the solar panels in the chloroplast that kind of take in that light. And when the light hits these solar panels, it excites these electrons that kind of jump around to these different chlorophyll pigments until it gets to what's called the reaction center, which is going to allow for the electron to go through the chain. Okay, so first off, you need to know about the photosystems. You got two photosystems. They are pretty much the solar panels that absorb the light. That is where the electrons are going to be excited. Okay, that's what you need to know about that. And it contains chlorophyll. The other thing you need to know is that water comes in during this part as well. So if you think about photosynthesis, you need light, water, and carbon dioxide. Well, this part of photosynthesis, the light cycle, is going to require light and water. Well, we know why it requires light. That's what's going to be used to excite these electrons to shoot the electrons down the chain. But why do we need water? Well, water is actually going to donate the electrons. Okay, so, and this isn't completely understood how this happens, but basically water is split somehow, and the electrons are donated into this kind of photosystem. All right. When water's split, it actually results in the release of oxygen as well. So if you look at the equation for photosynthesis, you get release of oxygen. Well, this is where that happens as well. So in the light reaction, you got light coming in, water coming in, and oxygen coming out. All right. So again, let's go over again. You got two photosystems. These are kind of the solar panels where light's going to come down. The light is absorbed here, and it excites the electrons. The electrons come from water. Otherwise, we would run out of electrons here. So our source of electrons is water. All right. So that's what you need to kind of understand so far. All right. So light comes down, excites the electrons. The electrons skip around the different chlorophylls until it hits the reaction center. The reaction center is then going to send it down this chain to the next photosystem. The photosystem, it's going to get excited again, and then it's going to go down a couple more proteins, and eventually, you need to understand this too, the electrons are going to be donated to make NADPH. All right, if we go back a slide, you remember with the light reaction, I'm going to get my pen out here, we're making two things. You're making ATP and you're making NADPH. Okay, well, here is where NADPH is made. You got light coming down, excites electrons, electrons pass through, and then eventually they're going to be donated to make NADPH. Okay, so you need to know that as well. You don't need to know all these crazy words and P680 and P700. You don't need to know all that stuff. You need to know that the electrons travel down, and at the end of the chain, the electrons are going to be donated to NADPH. This is just the stopping point. It's the end of the chain. These are where the electrons end up, as NADPH. Okay, this is non-cyclic because it goes straight through. Cyclic, on the other hand, does something a little different. So this is the same kind of setup in a little bit more simplified way. You got your two photosystems, photosystem 2, photosystem 1. Light comes down, excites the electrons pass through, they go to the next photosystem, they're excited again, and rather than going down and being donated to NADPH, it's going to actually cycle back to photosystem 2 to come back through. So it's kind of this cyclic flow. All right. Let me show you a different way that might make a little more sense. So you got the non-cyclic. You got photosystem 2. The light comes down, the electron is excited. Then it passes down the electron transport chain where it gets to photosystem 1. It's excited again, and eventually it's donated to make NADPH. Okay? Now let me turn off my little sound effects. And don't worry about this part too much yet, but this is where ATP is going to be made. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Right now I want you to understand NADPH because the electrons are going to be donated, and the NADPH is a very important thing that is made by the light cycle. Okay. Then you got the cyclic, which is a little different. This is showing the exact same thing as the non-cyclic, but what's different is the electron's not going to pass through to NADPH. It's actually going to cycle back to photosystem 2. All right? But when this happens, you're going to be able to make more ATP. This is why this does happen. Otherwise, why would it not just go to make NADPH? Well, sometimes it'll cycle through a couple times to make more ATP, and we'll talk about how this is done in a minute. All right? So again, you just need to know kind of the basics. You don't need to know all the players and the names. You need to know the basics, all right? So I can go through that one more time. Let's go back to this. So you got two photosystems. You need to know about the two photosystems, photosystem 2, photosystem 1. Light comes down, excites electrons. They skip around all these chlorophylls, and then they go down the chain. They can go through photosystem 1 again, and then go to the end and be donated to NADPH to form NADPH. Or they can cycle back. All right. You also need to know that water is what's going to donate the electrons to the system, and you need to know that oxygen is released at this point as well. Okay, so know the basics, but you do need to know those things that I just mentioned. Okay, so where is this all occurring? It's occurring in the thylakoid. So you have the chloroplast. All this kind of empty space is called the stroma, and all these little disc-looking things, these stacks of coin-looking things, are called thylakoids. Well, each one of these thylakoids, so this is a single, let's say, coin, if we're talking about stacks of coins. Well, here is the thylakoid membrane. And look, you got your double phospholipid layer, you got your tails in the middle, your head's on the outside, just like any other membrane that we've seen. And the electron transport chain is going to happen within the membrane. So all throughout the membrane, you're going to have these kind of scattered everywhere. Well, here's photosystem 2, here's photosystem 1, just like we've been talking about. Light comes down, you got these little chlorophyll pigments that are going to absorb the light. You have these electrons that will be excited. They'll be passed down the chain until they form NADPH. You also have water that's going to donate the electrons and release oxygen when it's split. Okay, so you got kind of our key players in what we've already talked about. What you need to know here is that it happens on the thylakoid membrane. All right? And we got lots of surface area too because we got tons of membrane here. All right, so each one of these chlorophylls looks like this. This is a chlorophyll molecule, okay? And it's got this magnesium in the middle. Well, why is the magnesium important? Well, this is where the electrons are going to be able to kind of skip through the different chlorophylls. If you look up on the periodic table and you kind of calculate it, and we're not going to do that now, but magnesium has 2 valence electrons, okay? There's 2 valence electrons. If this is excited, these 2 electrons will be will kind of pop off and go to the next chlorophyll, and they will just pass along all the magnesiums and all the chlorophylls, okay? But in order that to happen, we need electrons to come in. Well, that's where water comes in. Water is going to donate electrons to electrons that were lost here, okay? So that's basically what I just said. The splitting of water is going to replace those electrons in the photosystem. Because when light comes down and excites those, the electrons are going to skip and go down eventually down the electron transport chain. But if we didn't replace the electrons, they would just be gone. So we would have nothing else to go down the electron transport chain. That's why water is very important, to keep replenishing those electrons that are going to pass through all of these chlorophyll pigments to the reaction center, which is going to be able to pass it down the electron transport chain. Okay, and these guys are called antenna pigment molecules. This is where the light's going to come down and the electrons are going to kind of skip along these things, and then this one's the reaction center. And then this is just a picture showing that when water is split, you get your 2 electrons that are going to be donated into the photosystem, and then that's going to release oxygen. All right, so let's talk about how ATP is made, We've talked about how NADPH is made, and that's because it is at the very end of the electron transport chain, and those two electrons that pass down will turn NADP into NADPH, because it'll add two electrons and grab on a hydrogen and make NADPH, okay? So here's one thing that is made from the light cycle. The other thing that's made is ATP. Well, if you remember from biology, the electron transport chain allows for pumping of protons across the membrane. So if you have you're going to have protons floating around up here, and as electrons pass down, it's going to pump hydrogens into the thylakoid, okay? So eventually you're going to have tons of hydrogens in here, and as we know with diffusion, if you have more of something in one place, it's going to want to spread out. Sorry, this is written terribly. It's a hydrogen. If you got a bunch of hydrogen here, it's going to want to come out. And this is where it's going to come out. It's going to come through this little thing called ATP synthase. And when these hydrogens flow through, and this is natural, they want to come through here because they're going from high to low. When they go through, it allows this protein, however it does it, to spin in a way to where it's going to make ATP. So this guy, its only job is to make ATP, and it does it when hydrogen is allowed to come through. So really this electron transport chain is just setting up this high hydrogen gradient so that it will want to diffuse through here to make ATP. So that's how ATP is going to be made, is by stacking up all these hydrogens in the middle. And they're positively charged. They're going to want to separate from each other and diffuse through the membrane. Okay, so it's going to build potential energy. It's kind of like a battery. It's going to build potential energy in here so that it'll want to come out. That's why this membrane is so important, because it is separating the inside from the outside. And if you put a bunch of hydrogens in the inside, they're going to want to move outside. Okay, and this is just a close-up of this protein. The hydrogen comes through, and it allows this thing to move in a certain way that is going to form ATP. Okay. And this is called chemiosmosis. Chemiosmosis is when you kind of make that potential energy by stacking protons, for instance, on one side of the membrane, making them want to move through the other side. So you're making a high concentration of something. In this case, it's going to be hydrogen ions. And that's going to set up this potential energy, this kind of battery-like thing where it's going to want to move to the other side of the membrane. Okay? And it's energy coupling. It's allowing, this chemiosmosis is allowing for this protein to turn in a certain way and convert that energy into ATP chemical energy. Okay, so it's energy coupling. You're using the potential energy set up by chemiosmosis to allow this protein to make ATP. Okay, so it goes back to kind of that energy coupling where you're using energy from chemiosmosis to form ATP, to form chemical energy. All right, so again, just to highlight, the light reaction of photosynthesis, the whole point of it is to make these two things, because these two energy molecules are going to allow for the Calvin cycle to occur. And we've just gone through how ATP and NADPH is made through the light reaction, okay? And then the Calvin cycle, which we're going to talk about next, is going to use this chemical energy to make a different type of chemical energy, which is going to be food for whatever organism this is that's doing the photosynthesis. So the synthesis part is the Calvin cycle, where we're going to make sugar. Okay, here's your synthesis question. If you're at home, this might be good practice. If you're in class right now, get a piece of paper out, because I would like for you to turn this in.